Okay, another thing we see, and then you're going to see some pictures of the burials of humans, but we start to get formal cemeteries in the Natufian period, which is something that we don't see in earlier periods. Again, shows a different relationship between people and the deceased, but also it shows a different relationship between people and the land that they inhabit. One of the things I noticed from the burials was that there were more cavities in the teeth, and this reflects the very starchy diet that they had, the predominance of grains are now part of their diet. Also, because they're using these grinding stones to grind the grain, little pieces of the stone are mixed in with the flour, and as they eat the bread, it actually wore down their teeth. Okay, apart from plants, hunting was the predominant way that they got their meat at this point. Remember, they're not farmers yet. They're still hunters and gatherers, which means that they only collect what's in the wild. Because there's a lot of plant material locally available, they didn't have to move around as much. And the same with hunting. So they intensively hunted gazelles. That is, they would try to maximize the number of animals that they can get at a time. And one of the things archaeologists have found are these so-called kites in the desert. And these are structures that were built by the Natufians, like these walls that are kind of like a funnel with an area at the end. And what they would do is it looks like they would drive the gazelle towards this direction. They'd be more and more constricted the more they went down the kite until they ended up, in this area where they could be killed off easily by people, and they would not be able to escape because there were walls, and they would essentially again maximize the hunt. Okay, the burials this time are simple for the most part, but we start to see more and more grave goods, which is again something that we don't see in earlier periods. So personal wealth, personal ornamentation, necklaces, headbands, bracelets, belts, things that were made out of the shell, things that were made out of animal teeth, as you'll see. So here's a burial of a man from El Wad. You can see the beads made out of bone that would have formed a kind of a headdress here. This male had shell and also gazelle phalanx that were phalanges that were drilled and turned into a necklace. Here's a burial with stones placed on top of it. This one is interesting, from Anan, Malaha, because it's a dog that's buried with a person. So not only are they used in hunting, but it looks like they were pets as well. And there's debate about where the earliest evidence for dog domestication is. Is this the earliest? We know that dogs were domesticated before this time period, but in terms of physical evidence. Also, in the early Natufian, we see group burials and single burials. By the late Natufian, it's really more single burials. What does that show? Potentially it shows more of a focus on the individual. That's what some people think. Here's another picture of that burial. You can see with it's hard to see the dog up here, but there's a young dog next to the person. Here's a 25-year-old man with 365 shell beads here, and a belt that was made out of, and you can see here, perforated fox teeth. Okay, so what do we see in general? The Natufians, there's a transition from mobile hunting and gathering, right, and the beginnings of sedentism, population growth, right, and a focus on the plants that would eventually become domesticated. Okay, what happens when you become sedentary? Well, there's a number of things that can happen. We talked about population growing. Community will also get bigger. We said that Natufian sites in general are bigger than the Kabaran sites. If you're not moving around as much, there's the potential that you will overuse your local resources. You can now start to store things, which means you can accumulate things. You could eventually start accumulating things like wealth. That's something else we start to see with the Natufians. There's sort of an increased territoriality with people once they become sedentary. As the communities get larger, you also have to figure out other ways of dealing with conflict and negotiation and disputes. And like we saw with the mouse bones and connected to that, the more people per area, the more likelihood that disease will spread. So potential increase from disease. We saw already cavities in the teeth, and cavities are not something that we normally see with hunters and gatherers in the Paleolithic. It's really something that we start to see with first with intensive use of plants, and then again later with agriculture. Okay, we saw also the evidence for sedentism, permanent structures, food storage, seasonal food from all months represented. Okay, well now let's look at the shift to agriculture. One of the things that some people have brought up, some people mention, like Jared Diamond, who I'm sure you've read or at least heard of his book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, is that agriculture is a better lifestyle and a better system than hunting and gathering. Hunters and gatherers would automatically see the benefits of agriculture. And that's not true, because in many ways, hunting and gathering is a better lifestyle and a better system than agriculture. There's certain advantages and disadvantages to agriculture. Let's go through some of the advantages. You could probably think of some of the main advantages to hunting and gathering and some of the main advantages to agriculture, right? But one of the main advantages of agriculture is that you can produce more food. And if you can produce more food, you can support larger populations. You can also have surplus, and surplus will free up some people from having to work in the fields, and they can specialize in other things like crafts or other kinds of specialties. So agriculture allows for wealth differences, allows for specialization, it allows for larger and larger populations. Those are the main advantages of agriculture. But there are some very profound disadvantages. And the disadvantages especially are related to health and leisure time. So studying the Kung, hunters and gatherers in the Kalahari Desert of South Africa, anthropologists found that the adult men and women only had to work 12 to 19 hours per week to support the whole community. So children, I think below 10 or 11 or something like that, but children and older people didn't go and collect and gather and hunt. So it was mainly just the adults, but still they could support the whole community from 12 to 19 hours per week. Also, the health is a lot better as a hunter and gatherer than it is as an agriculturalist. And we're going to see this with several sites. But as a hunter and gatherer, you're getting enough calories, enough protein, you're getting a good amount of exercise, you're having the right kind of diet, not a diet that's only focused on starchy foods. And we can see this with health data and skeletons throughout the world. So, for example, the study of skeletons from Greece found that when they were hunters and gatherers before agriculture, average height for men was 5'9", average height for women was 5'5". With the appearance of agriculture, The average height for men was 5'3", and the average height for women was 5 foot. There was also evidence of anemia, malnutrition, and dental disease. And we're going to see some of the other negative health impacts. Here you could kind of see, upper Paleolithic humans, right, 5 foot 10 inches, and then a decrease with agriculture, and then slowly a gradual increase back to those earlier levels. So advantages with agriculture: you could produce a lot of food, you could support a lot of people. Those people are not necessarily going to be healthy or as healthy as they were when they were hunters and gatherers. Okay, so why did people domesticate plants and animals in the first place? Well, there have been a number of different theories. We're going to look at two of the main early theories. We'll mention some of the others. But you could sort of categorize the theories into different groups, right? One group would be what we call push models. There's some sort of force that's pushing people to develop agriculture. It could be an outside force like climate change. And then there are pull models. That is, people are not forced to do it, but it's sort of an internal development within a human community, people getting better and better at certain things. So let's look at one of the early models, which is a push model. This was developed by V. Gordon Childe. He was kind of an armchair archaeologist. You could see him in his armchair right here. And he came up with the idea called the oasis hypothesis. According to his idea, the climate became worse before agriculture. People had to go where there were oases, well-watered places. As they lived in those places, they couldn't expand out because there was desert around them. As the population started to increase, there was a crisis because they needed more food. So what did they do? They started to deliberately experiment with plants and cultivate the plants and try and make them more productive, and that resulted in domestication of plants and domestication of animals. So that was a first attempt to come up with a reason. Kathleen Kenyon tested his theory at Jericho, and then a little bit later, Robert Braidwood, who is one of the first people to do the new archaeology in the Near East, the processional archaeology that's scientific, wanted to test his own idea. Right? So obviously with the new archaeology, processional archaeology, because it's supposed to be scientific, you generate a hypothesis, you go out and you collect data, you see if the data supports your hypothesis, and then you might have to revise your hypothesis. And you could come up with your own hypothesis to figure out why agriculture occurred in the Middle East. You might want to just pause the video for just a minute and see if you could write down on a piece of paper a hypothesis that would that you could test to explain why agriculture appeared in the ancient Middle East. And then think about how you would actually test that. What data would support your hypothesis? So, for example, so why don't you try and come up with one and then unpause the video? So there's a number of different ones you probably could have come up with. Imagine if you thought that it was increasing population. So rather than the climate changing and people being forced to oases, you thought people were just living in the Middle East. Population slowly got bigger over time. It put a stress on people, and they had to develop greater food resources, and that led to agriculture. Well, you could test that, right? You could figure out the number of villages, the number of houses per village, look at it over time, and see if there's a dramatic increase over time in in the different in the different villages and see if that predates agriculture. So new archaeology is focused on answering a question. Today, if you wanted to write a grant to work at a site in the Middle East, you have to have some sort of question that you're trying to answer. You can't just say, I want to dig at this site because I know there's things to find there. It has to be focused on the question. So Robert Braidwood was one of the first ones to do this in the Middle East. And what he thought is that rather than people being pushed, the technology just got better and better and better. The people were experimenting with local plants and animals, and over time they got better at raising them, rearing them, picking and choosing which ones would mate, and this led to domestication. So rather than sites appearing in oases, and if you thought child was correct, what you would find is that in areas, small, isolated areas like oases, that's where you would find the earliest agriculture. Robert Braidwood thought that you would find the earliest agriculture where the wild plants and animals grow in the Middle East, which is essentially the Fertile Crescent. And he coined the term the hilly flanks. That is that's part of the Fertile Crescent that's near the foothills of the mountains. So to test his idea, he went to an area where there were still wild goats, wild wheat in northern Iraq, a site called Jarmo. He excavated it in the 50s, and what he found is these kind of mud houses, 30 houses in this village, population of 150 to 200. Each house had its own oven, and he felt that, and he found also animal bones. He found grinding tools for wheat and barley. He also found pieces of barley and wheat. He found bins for storage. He found bones of goats, sheep, pigs, and cattle. Some of the animals were only a year old when they were killed. We're going to talk about why that matters, because that shows human control. He found digging sticks, flint sickles, obsidian tools, shells from the Persian Gulf, pendants, clay figurines of animals, and things like that. And because it was found in this area, he thought was the earliest agricultural village in this natural habitat zone, and that's why his theory is called the natural habitat hypothesis. He found early agriculture exactly where he predicted it would be. So he thought that supported his hypothesis. Problem with his hypothesis is it doesn't explain why agriculture appeared at a certain time. This is Robert Braidwood over here. He was a professor at the University of Chicago, joint at the Oriental Institute and the Anthropology Department. Okay, well, it turns out that Binford wasn't totally correct. Neither was Child, as we're going to see. In the 60s, there was new theories that were proposed, right? So one that was sort of along the same lines was the edge zone hypothesis, right? According to this one, Binford, who created the new archaeology, a guy named Ken Flannery's at the University of Michigan, they thought that as the population increased, people had to leave the nuclear zone, right? Had to leave where the wild plants grew, and they found themselves in edge zones where things didn't grow as well, and then they were forced to domesticate plants and animals. So it's a little bit like Child's theory, but a slight variation there. Again, with this theory, it's a little bit like the the population theory that we were talking about earlier, you would expect to see a sharp increase in population before the development of agriculture, and you would see evidence of people moving to these edge zones, and that earliest agriculture should appear in these edge zones. It doesn't really work the way that they say. So this model is not really predictive of agriculture. It doesn't explain why it occurred. Another model we'll talk about is the prestige model. It's like a pull model, like Robert Braidwood's, but here it's dealing with individuals within the community who are trying to get more social standing than others. And this is very similar to what you see in societies like New Guinea, known as big men societies. You may have read or heard about these when you took an anthropology course, like cultural anthropology. But in big men societies, certain individuals try to gain more status, power, and standing in the community by accumulating resources and then giving away these resources, usually in the context of feasting. And as a result, they gain loyalty, they gain the obligations of people, and they also gain political power and social standing in the community. They become big men. We're going to talk more about this when we start getting into complex societies. Big men are not permanent roles within the society. You're not, you don't, pass on your status to your children. So according to Brian Hayden and also Bender, they believe that individuals within these Natufian communities were trying to become more and more savvy and politically powerful, and they were trying to do it like big men have done in many other cultures, and the only way that they could become more and more powerful was by generating more and more food. And so they started to deliberately try and cultivate more and more food so that they could have feasts and become big men. It's an interesting idea. It's one that's very hard to test. Another interesting idea, again, this is one that it's hard to test. There is some evidence to support it, a little bit of evidence, is maybe one of the incentives to domesticate wheat and barley was not for its use in bread, but actually its use in making beer. And that once people discovered beer, it gave them more and more incentive to try and make barley and wheat really productive so they could produce more beer. There is some evidence that there was ancient beer in the Natufian period, so 13,000-year-old beer. They feel that they had evidence of beer making. You can see in this early site in Israel, and there's obviously advantages of beer. And you can think about why beer was drunk in the Middle Ages by even children. Why even the early settlers and the European settlers in North America drank beer. As these villages get bigger and bigger and bigger, the possibility that you can start contaminating your water supply, the river where you draw your water, grows very high, right? Because many times garbage, fecal matter, other things end up in the river, and if you drink from it, you can get very, very sick. You can transmit diseases to other people very easily, like cholera and typhoid fever. But beer, because it has some alcohol in it, even 3% alcohol, what we would call, low alcohol beer, the alcohol would be enough to kill off these organisms. So beer would be much healthier to drink rather than just the water from the river, which could be contaminated. And then there's also the obvious mind-altering properties of beer that made it a special drink for people. So beer might have been a little bit of an incentive, but again, it's hard to really quantify it. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at is what we think happened, or from Ofer Bar Yosef's opinion, based on all of the data that have been accumulated and his work. What do we think happened, and why did agriculture appear in the Near East?